happens in this case? How do we change our life? How do we generate value for anyone so that whenever you need to analyze some data, how do you get the analysis out? How do you get the information out of the data and explain it to the stakeholders? That's something that we're seeing very often. And based on that, we are seeing a lot of change in the role. Data abundance. So it's again, we have seen that the data is now increasing in size, and not just that, the sources of data, they are also changing day over day, and day in and day out. So if you think of like 10-15 years back, we would have limited set of sources. We would have SFTP, flat files, databases, and all these things. These were very common, so we would use them as a source, and then we would process the data, perform an ETL job, create an analysis services model, and show it in a report. That was a simple thing that we had, and we used to call it as BI or business intelligence. But in today's world, when we have so many different varieties of data, we get data from different sources. Think of it the IoT systems. So if you have an Internet of Things connected systems, there are so many sensors which are generating the data. If you have a smart bulb in your home which is connected to the internet, that is generating data at a huge scale at every second, and that's a different type of data which we didn't have a concept 10 years back. So the sources of data is changing rapidly, and the format of data is also changing rapidly. Another example is if you do any kind of no structured data. So I'll come to the no structured data. I'm just saying that if you want to do any kind of audio analysis, if you want to do any kind of video analysis, all these things were not possible to do in 10-15 years back. So now you see that you have so many smart devices connected to the source, connected in your home. They are generating data, they have to process the data. So these things are changing rapidly. So the landscape of data is changing so much that the data is becoming huge in size. Now, if we talk about the format of the data, there can be different format of the data. We can have still structured data, which we can use in the typical SQL database or a SQL data warehouse, or we can have unstructured data, which are this new type of data that we have. For that also, we have different tools and technologies in Azure. Not just that, not just the storage and the variety of data. When we deal with any kind of data, we have to keep in mind different things. So if you're working in a organization, or if you're working in a project where the client or the project is from a specific region, you have to maintain the GDPR or the General Data Protection Rule and all the other different standards. This is very important when we are dealing with data. I'm pretty sure that all of you have experienced this, is that there are so many classification of data that we have, and you cannot get the data out of the specific region, you cannot store it in a different format. If you store it in a different format, you have to do encryption. So there are different rules that we have to set up in the data. So we just don't deal with data from different format or different volume. When we store the data, we have to keep these things in mind as well. Another concept is the language. So it's not always that we will store the data in a specific language. We can store the data, or we have to store the data in different languages as well. When I say language, I'm talking about English and other spoken languages. That's something also we have to keep in mind. Then we have the different format and the visualization. So it's not always that we will have only one visualization. Like, I'm not gonna be able to only show my reports in Power BI. There can be scenario where I might have to create a report which can be visualized in maybe Tableau, maybe ClickView, or maybe a simple Excel report. So we have to analyze our data and create a data set which could be easily served and feed to the specific visualization tool. Because at the end of the day, whenever we deal with any kind of data, the final layer or the final stage of my data is the visualization, where we actually get the information out of my. Keeping all these things in mind, Microsoft continuously releases new technologies to the Azure platform, and whenever you work in that, we have different things to play with. Okay, so this is a simple concept of data. Now, when we think about the data, again, since we are moving to cloud, first and foremost, we have to understand how we previously had to work with the data and what advantages does cloud bring into us, why we are actually moving to the cloud, why there is a sudden shift in moving to the cloud environment. Let's understand the difference between on-premises and cloud-based servers. So typically, whenever we have previously worked on, we have been working on the on-premises infrastructure. And now that we have seen that a lot of clients are moving towards the digital and they're moving to the cloud space. Now let's look into first what are the on-premises environment we have. So first and foremost, when we talk about the on-premises environment, we have the computing environment. So what is a computing environment? Computing environment is nothing but you buy your physical hardware. So you have to buy your servers, your network infrastructure, and your storage. Now, to have all these things working in tandem, you have to have a power, you have to have cooling, you have to have periodic maintenance, and the most important thing is that the upgradation. So you know that whenever Microsoft releases a product, maybe it's an OS, maybe it's a server, maybe it's a database, all of them have an end of life cycle. So if I'm not wrong, currently the from a SQL Server perspective, if you don't have a long-term licensing, Microsoft does not support SQL Server 2008 or 2008 R2. So all the products that Microsoft has, they have an end of life cycle. Is there a question? Okay. So you have to maintain your upgradation log available. Like whenever a product is coming to the end of life cycle, you have to upgrade your product. So these things are always there whenever you're working in an on-premises environment. Then we have the cost of licensing, not just the operating system. Whenever you buy a physical hardware, you of course need an operating system. So this OS will have a cost associated with it. On top of that, if you buy any software, the softwares are also have a licensing. Now, this is a specific type. I'm pretty sure all of you know about this, the client access license. So what happens is that if you go for a CAL is something where Microsoft or any other vendor gives you a preferential rate. If you buy, a bulk product, so you get a preferential licensing rate, which Microsoft calls as CAL or client access license. And as companies grow, licensing arrangements become more restrictive. Then we have the maintenance. This is again one of the pain areas that we have seen. If you have your own software and you run your devices, you have to maintain them so that they don't clog up and they don't fail. And this not just includes your hardware. You have to update your firmware, drivers, BIOS, OS, your software, antivirus. All these things are required for you to maintain. So these things are also part of your regular maintenance. Then we have the two most pain areas, the scalability and availability. Now think of it like this. This is something, guys, I'm saying from my personal experience. So when in a traditional on-premises environment, when we create a physical environment for any of the customers, let's give something that we have faced. So it was quite a years back. So we designed a solution, and for that we had to go for a SQL Server. Now I'm talking about a time when SQL Server was not at all available on Linux or Unix system. It was only available on Windows Server. So if I'm not wrong, it was 2005 or 2008 R2. It was pretty old. So based on several discussions with the client, how much data they're expecting, how much will be the transaction rate, all these things we discussed, and we came to the conclusion that since we're going for a SQL Server, of course we need to have a Windows Server with us. So we decided that we'll go for a Windows Server, where we'll have a Xeon processor with, I don't remember exact configuration, but it was something like we would have 16 cores and we would have a co-processor. And along with that, we will have a SQL Server. So that SQL Server will have 90% memory allocated. And we had 128 GB of RAM in that. And we had somewhere around 68 to 128 IOPS. So we went for that configuration. Now what happens is that in a typical project, your data sizes increases over time. So after 3 to 5 years, this client was actually having memory bottlenecks. So what you have to do, if you have memory bottlenecks, you of course have to increase your hardware. So the same thing needed to be done there. So they had to increase their RAM, they had to increase their storage, and all these things require a bit of time. So in a typical, organization, it's not that you're choking on your memory. You just swap the hard disk and you increase the disk space, or you just swap the RAM and you increase the RAM. There are a lot of things that needs to be done. Based on that, they can take a decision and they can increase their hardware. So scalability is a very, painful area in an on-premises world, where if you're choking for memory, it's not just always that you need to upgrade. There are scales where you need to maybe, downscale also. Maybe you're not utilizing that. For example would be a dev system or a QA system where you don't need to go for such a high volume of data transfer. It will not happen. So you might have to downscale there. Now what happens is, again, think of it from a licensing cost. Since we don't need that much power in SQL Server, so I cannot, or any customer cannot go and buy different versions of SQL Server licenses. So maybe they want to say that, okay, for my dev and my QA system, I'll go for a SQL Server Developer Edition, or for my production, I'll go for a SQL Server Enterprise. Now that your cost increases significantly because you're buying different licenses. So what typically clients used to do is that they'll buy a bulk of SQL Server Enterprise license and they'll create separate instances for different environment.